Net Wealth Investments Limited is licensed to provide general advice. Our podcasts are not tailored to any one financial situation and may contain views of our presenters which may not align with Net Wealth's. The guests' organisation and Net Wealth have an arrangement for their financial products to be available for investment through the Net Wealth platforms, and Net Wealth may receive fees from the guest. More information about Net Wealth can be found on our website, including our financial services guide and disclosure documents. Please seek professional advice before acting.
Whatever you're doing in life, you got to have values and principles, and I have a few that I live by. It's got to be just, fair and equitable. It's got to be right.
Founders in the business still have client responsibilities. That is hard. If you don't, you lose touch too quickly.
It's always going to cost you more and take you longer, but if you do it the right way, you'll get there in the end.
Hi, I'm Matt Heiner, Managing Director of Net Wealth, and welcome to Between Meetings. In this podcast series, I chat to industry professionals and thought leaders on what made their careers successful and the opportunities and challenges they see on a wide range of topics as they relate to the delivery of advice and financial services. I hope you enjoy their unique insights. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to be here.
I'm delighted to introduce Jennifer Risher to the show today. Jennifer's been in town for the last couple of weeks watching the tennis, but reading through some of Jennifer's background's fascinating. She describes herself as an author, an investor, a philanthropist, amongst many other things. But Jennifer, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in this area?
Thank you, Matt. I'm very interested in the emotional side of money. Money is a very emotional topic, and it's also a very sensitive topic. I'll start with my background. So I got really lucky. When I was 25, 1991, I joined Microsoft, and it was there I met my husband on the very first day. We were in line together at orientation. And then I got stock that was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. David's stock was worth millions. 6 years later, when we were married and expecting our first child, we were both working at Microsoft still. David took a job at a small startup. He was very interested in books, and he wanted to work at this startup that was selling books on the internet called Amazon.com. And he was the 37th employee there. The company went public shortly after he started. We were in our early 30s, and suddenly we had more money than we could really wrap our heads around. So I want to say up front that money makes life easier, and I'm very, very fortunate. Wealth surprised me. Having a lot of money doesn't feel the way the fantasy looks. And of course, it's great, but it was strange. It felt strange to me, and I quickly realized that we get such a narrow and incomplete view of what wealth is. We see the highly visible wealthy. We know, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. We know the Kardashians. We see the highly visible wealth, and we know stereotypes. But the reality felt very different for that. And I think people with wealth are so much more diverse than what we see or believe. And in fact, 8 out of 10 people with wealth grew up middle class or poor. And yet, even though we're new to the experience of having a lot of money, we're not talking to each other about it. And there's so many emotional complexities that come up. Even for those who have inherited wealth or generational wealth, often families don't talk to each other. Money is such a taboo subject. And so it's not something that gets discussed. And normally, in my life, when I have a problem or an issue, as a parent, if I have a question, I talk to my friends. It's kind of how I do my research. I get information that way. I hear different perspectives. But the same doesn't happen with money-related issues. So I couldn't really talk about some of the things I was feeling about money. And that's really problematic. When you don't talk about something, it can tend to loom large. It can take on a life of its own. It also becomes, kind of hidden and in the dark and creates a sense of shame. So what I've done is write a book, the book that I needed and wanted to read for myself. There were no one to talk to. And then I looked around, where can I read about this situation of having more money than you had growing up or having more money than others in your family? Where's the book about that? And there really were no books. There was people approached the topic of wealth, from a research perspective or as a sociological study, but there was no human personal stories about that experience. And so I, really wrote the book I needed to read. I spent a long time writing it, and it was published a couple years ago, and now I'm doing a lot of talking with the goal of helping other people like me have conversations that often get avoided so that they can move out of any guilt or shame or fear around their money and into a sense of real purpose and action. And I also believe that my story is interesting and important for advisors of clients who have wealth. It offers an insight that you don't hear about it because you don't hear the kind of the human personal stories about money.
Jennifer, that's a fantastic story, and there's a lot that we're going to come back to in a moment, but I'd love to just chat about the early days for a moment. You said you got lucky. You almost made it sound so easy. I happened to be at Microsoft and we happened to be at Amazon. What were you doing back then? What was the role and what was the environment like? Presumably it was very much at the start of both of those companies.
Yeah, it was a kind of an amazing place to work, Microsoft. My friend called me. I was working in advertising. I had no interest in computers. My friend called me and said, hey, there's a position open in recruiting. And living in Seattle, Microsoft was like the big thing. It was full of energy, full of ambitious, young people. So I thought, that's interesting. Maybe I can kind of enter Microsoft and work in marketing eventually at Microsoft. So I was fortunate enough to get the job and started at Microsoft where, the average age was under 30. I went right into a position in recruiting. So my job was to hire people out of business schools into product management. And it was at the time at Microsoft where they were looking to expand and looking to hire young people who were eager and hungry and ready to work hard. And our mantra in recruiting was smart, works hard, gets things done. And this came from Bill Gates. He was kind of really driving the whole culture of the company. And his drive was work 24 hours a day and be smart. I don't care about your credentials. I don't care about past knowledge. I care about you just able to solve problems and get things done. And the atmosphere really was, 24 hours a day. Who's the most ambitious? Who's going to drive hardest? Which was both exciting and exhausting. But it actually was a very exciting time to be at Microsoft. There was also, now many companies do this, but there was free drinks on every floor in the and there's a cafeteria where they could get a latte and everyone had a membership to a sports club. So they were trying to keep you there for a long time and keep you happy and everyone was young. So I think there were a lot of Microsoft marriages that came out of that time.
We spend quite a lot of time talking about culture on the show and just what drives high performance. So there's obviously a fast-growing company, a lot of employees. Bill Gates, who was a figurehead. Did you catch up with him at the tennis, by the way?
I did hear he was there, but I did not see him. Yeah, he loves tennis.
Loves tennis. What were some of the other things that the business was doing to really drive that performance?
A lot of competition, I guess, and individual performer. I mean, I think people, came out of business school and they got a ton of responsibility right away. So you were hired into a product group and you were responsible for a product. My husband, David, was responsible for a new database product called Access, and he felt the responsibility and could take things in the direction he wanted to go. I mean, it was a very flat organization, so there weren't a lot of managers. There was not a lot of red tape. You could get things done quickly. And there was just a general vibe of like, we are out to change the world. And the mantra, the mission was to put a computer on every desktop. And everyone in the company was, focused on that. And technical knowledge was highly valued. Smarts were we were all kind of a little bit, I don't know, we thought highly of ourselves as Microsoft employees. And I think that came from Bill Gates himself. I mean, there was definitely a sense of like, you got to get it all together. You have to have all the details. You have to have the vision. I mean, the very famous Bill G meetings, Bill Gates, Bill G. In fact, it comes from the email name. When I joined Microsoft, I was known as Jennifer. I always called myself Jennifer. But when I got to Microsoft, they assigned me, my last name was Stewart, and they assigned me Jen ST as my email name. And I was known as Jen ST since then. So Bill G meetings were when you came, had your product plan and business plan together and you'd go in and kind of present to Bill. And they could last for a day and hours. And he didn't suffer fools. And he would yell people out of his office. People would be crying. It was very intense. So there was a real intensity that came from the top. And you need to be number one. You need to be the best.
So your husband would have been fine when he moved across to Amazon and had to have a similar relationship with Jeff Bezos.
The same thing happened at Amazon, exactly. Very similar culture, actually.
So it's interesting coming back to the book. You had all of these people around you that presumably were getting similar stock options, were suddenly very wealthy overnight, but none of you were talking about it or working through the issues it created.
Yeah, it's very strange. At first, and this is from Bill Gates too, like he was a very frugal person. He was working nonstop. He very famously at the time only flew coach. He wore a sweater and jeans and he was, working. He wasn't flashing well. Well, it was very much like a culture of frugality and heads down. Work was like the primary thing, working hard. And so money was not talked about. There was at this same, and there weren't like incredible cars in the parking lot. Everyone kind of was driving a normal car. There was not a lot of flashy wealth. And I think that's sort of true of Seattle as a city too. It's kind of low keyed. But over time, as the stock, when I was there, the stock just took off. And at a certain point, people were tracking it and they knew how many options they had. They could see that they made $100,000 today because of the stock price going up. And so there was a sense of the excitement around that. At the same time, there was no real conversation about what it meant, how it affected your identity, how it affected your relationships. And that's the impact of it was not discussed. And it did have an impact on me, especially kind of later on with we kind of came into the wealth of Amazon. It impacted me as a parent. Was I going to spoil our kids? It impacted me as a sister. My brother, was he resentful? And it impacted me as a friend. I didn't want to be seen as other. I didn't want to be judged. I wasn't worried about people liking me for my money. I was worried about people hating me for it. I didn't want anyone to know. I grew up kind of thinking of being responsible and not wasteful, and spending was, excessive spending was bad. Saving was important. The rich kind of seemed like other and them. And so I had become that. And so it's a little painful to feel as though my parents might disapprove of what I had. So there were a lot of things going on for me emotionally that just weren't being discussed. And I do appreciate that I had some good friends going through the same thing. But looking back, I think, wow, we didn't really talk about the reality.
You went about writing a book, and through that process, no doubt, a lot of discovery. What were the key learnings that you came to? Obviously, talking about it and having that conversation has been really important, but you've just sort of listed off a number of items with all very different outcomes, I imagine.
So the book, it was in itself a therapeutic process. It was actually a long process. It took me 14 years to write the book. I guess the kind of the best way to describe that journey of writing was, I started out, the titles of the book have changed as I've changed. So initially, it really was examining my own experience, and it was titled The Embarrassment of Riches. And it was actually The Embarrassment of Riches for many years. And I was teaching myself to write by doing it and trying to figure out, okay, how do I piece together all these different experiences in a way that's compelling for other people? How do I talk about money in a way that's not offensive? And it was tricky. And I remember at one point I went to a writer's workshop, and it's probably 4 years in, and I was at this writer's workshop, and I was really excited because, I was surrounded by writers. I was going to be able to talk about the craft. And I remember the woman at the beginning was like, okay, look around yourself. You're, surrounded by people who love the written word and the story. And that was all great until I realized I had to introduce myself to people. And then the first thing people would ask me is, what are you writing about? And hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm writing about wealth. And it was really difficult to say that and to feel, I felt very judged. And, I spent time crying in my room. It was really tricky. And I remember one woman, I said, I'm writing about, having a lot of money. And she looked at me and she's like, you don't look rich. That was embarrassing, right? That was an embarrassment of riches. So it was an embarrassment of riches for a long time. Then it was the tiniest violin. Now, how can I be complaining and talking about this and what sensibly is a positive? So it was the tiniest violin. Then it was the last taboo. Actually, it was Confessions of a Rich Woman for a while, then The Last Taboo. Then It's Not About the Money. And then it became kind of what you don't talk about when you don't talk about money. And then I landed on We Need to Talk, a memoir about wealth, and I'm happy with that title because it is a call to action. I think we do need to talk, and I think it's important. We learn from each other's stories. And so by sharing my story, I'm hoping that other people, and I've found this to be true, people are very thankful to hear my story because it helps them understand their own story.
So where did the conversation start? When you had to have that conversation with your parents or your sister, how did it go?
Yeah, initially I did not have conversations, and it was very stark because when Amazon went public, we also had this new baby, and it was like so incredible to be a mom. I had no idea. My heart opened. It was the most powerful thing that had ever happened. And, this curtain had lifted, and I was in the world of parenthood. I joined a mother's group, met with other women. other new moms, we shared so much in common and we bonded over being new parents. At the same time, this other curtain had lifted and we had all this money. And in that space, there was silence. And I didn't want anyone in my mother's group to know that we had this new wealth. I didn't want to be seen as other. I was just felt like any other new mom. I look back at that and I think, in the name of staying connected with these other women and being accepted, I hid a big part of what was going on in my life. So I think, well, how connected was I really? And I think having the ability to talk about what was really going on would have been helpful for me. And so I'm thinking about how conversation really does help us because, like I think I said before, like when you don't talk about something, it's just kept hidden. It creates shame. It creates a sense of guilt and fear. And if you put it into the light, you can look at it for what it is. And then money is a tool and it's something, that I have and it's very fortunate, but it's not everything. And so being able to talk through kind of the emotions that come up. And I'll share some stories just to kind of illustrate the importance of talking. And my first story is, this is a friend who's middle class. And she told me how, she and her husband drove the same car for many, many years. And they said, when that thing finally broke down, I bought an Audi Q5. This was a luxury car she'd always wanted. And she was really happy. She loved the car and she was excited about her purchase and until she started to think about going to visit her sister and driving up in the car. In her mind, she kind of imagined her sister saying, "Ooh, aren't we fancy?" And then in her mind, she started to justify the car. Well, it was used. It wasn't that expensive. So even before she saw her sister, she was telling herself stories. She was making assumptions. What if she actually talked to her sister? Because, when we don't talk about something, then it looms large and we make up stories and we have all these ideas. If she had really addressed that with her sister, I think she could have, really connected to her. I think we aren't used to kind of addressing the emotional piece around money. So we don't have the experience of doing it. But on the other side of that discomfort, I think there's really a sense of relief and a real chance to connect. And that's really what's important, our relationships and our connections. Another personal story is about me and my brother. So I have a brother who's 2 years younger. After high school, he went into the Peace Corps and then he got a teaching job. He got his master's in Spanish, got a job as a teacher, high school teacher. And at the same time, David and I, had this new wealth. My brother wanted to buy a house. And so we offered him $20,000 towards the down payment. At the time, he said, "I don't want this money. I want to live within my own means." So he refused our gift and that hurt my feelings. I was already feeling kind of strange about the money and I thought he was looking down at the money and down at me. And I felt hurt by that, but I didn't say anything to him. We didn't address it. We just kind of moved on. And the next point was when he was getting married and I sent a check as a wedding gift. And this time he actually accepted it. And when his first child was born, we sent another check and he and his wife thanked us. And then we began writing a check every year and sending it to my brother. And after several years, he stopped even acknowledging these checks that we were sending. And I started to feel resentful and kind of taken for granted. But I didn't say anything. I made up stories in my mind. I made assumptions. I thought, well, he's embarrassed by it, or he thinks we have so much money, it just doesn't mean anything to us. Or I kind of excusing him in my mind just with these stories. And then, even though I'm not proud to admit it, because I was feeling taken for granted, I just didn't send him a check one year. The next time we were communicating over email, he wrote his email, and then at the end of the email, he said, "Wondering if a certain year-end check is just late in the mail. Is it?" And I read that, and it made me really angry, and I was shocked by it and upset. And of course, I knew that we needed to talk about this, and especially since I was at the time writing a book about it, and I know it's important to have conversations, but I have to admit it's not easy. And I really had to sit down and think about, what do I want to say? What am I feeling here? Then when I got on the phone and I said, you haven't really thanked us or acknowledged the gifts that we've been giving you, and it really hurts my feelings. He apologized right away. He didn't realize. And in fact, he said, I actually thought that it was easier for you if I didn't make a big deal out of the gifts, which makes sense given how we grew up. We didn't talk about money and it wasn't important. And so it completely made sense. And then when we started really talking to each other and connecting, that is the moment we could put money in its place as a tool. and not something bigger than us. And we could really talk about it. And he said, I don't need this money, but I really appreciate it. And thank you. And I had never asked because I no strings attached. I'm giving you this gift, but I'm curious, what are you doing with it? I want to be part of your life. I want to know. And that really connected us. And it was meaningful for me to have that conversation, and it brought us back together. And actually, it's interesting now, that was several years ago. Now, Christmas has just happened, and we wrote the check, and I sent him the check again. And I also sent him, He's in the Foreign Service now, and he's living in Bogota, Colombia. And I sent him a card with a check for $300 saying, go out, have a real date night, treat yourself to a really nice meal. I want to take you out for dinner. And so I gave him that gift as well. And I got a lot of response from that gift. I got pictures of the two of them having dinner and thank you. And this is what we ate. And this is where we ate. And she sent me a note saying how much she appreciated it. But neither of them mentioned the other gift. And you know what? It doesn't bother me. I feel like we've had a connection around that. And I understand. And I'm in a different place too around our money. I'm much more comfortable with it. And I feel really grateful and privileged to be able to support my brother that way. And so it's a constant evolution.
Thanks for sharing that. I think one of the titles of the book was The Smallest Violin,
yes.
Which I can imagine a lot of people, when you did stand up, said, well, hang on, why is this a problem? Why are we even talking about it?
Yes.
So back in the early days, who did you have in your corner? Had you been to see professional advisors? Did you have accountants? Who was helping you make that transition and work out what to do with your newfound wealth?
It's really interesting. I started to come into my own personal money with Microsoft. A friend of mine told me, well, I'm working with this woman advisor. And so I started working with her initially. And then when Amazon happened and the wealth was really big, and we kind of looked around for an advisory firm and started working with a firm in Seattle called Brighton Jones, which was very necessary for just technical reasons. But then we realized that we had so many questions, and all of it was new. Like one of the big questions, what do we do in terms of ensuring our kids aren't spoiled? And what do we do with money for them? Do we, set up a trust? What do we do? We were completely overwhelmed. We had no guidelines. And I couldn't talk to my parents. David couldn't talk to his mom. We couldn't talk to friends. And there was really no one to guide us except for our advisor. Plus, there's no place where it's okay to talk, at least at the time, to talk about money. And there's one space where it's expected to talk about money, and that's with your advisor. So our advisor became, not only our financial advisor, but our therapist, our counselor, our best friend, a source of information. And I remember so clearly, being so hungry for information about, how are we doing? Are we handling this well? Are we spending too much, too little? How are we doing? And wanting that kind of data on other people like us. And although, of course, there's, privacy issues and everywhere, but I remember our advisor telling us the story of, saying, you guys are doing great and you're doing well, your kids will be fine, assuring us, but also saying, I have one client he's really overspending. He really cares about wine. He's buying all these, he's created this big wine cellar and he's buying a ton of expensive wines. He's going to run out of money in 5 years. And so that stuck. That was a story I heard 30 years ago, and it stuck with me because it was so important to hear what other people are doing. And in fact, it's still very important to hear that. My husband and I have become very philanthropic, and we don't know, are we more philanthropic than others? Do we give more percentage of our wealth? And I remember hearing David ask, well, how are we compared to other clients? It's still like a very human desire to kind of know where you are in how you fit into the world. So I think advisors, you're in such an interesting and important role in helping people think through kind of the way they want to show up with their money and their values, and how to help them kind of talk with family members, open up the questions, create you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a psychologist, but you're creating a safe space to talk about something where your clients probably don't have a lot of places to talk about these things, and open the door to that. And I think people will be very grateful and feel that that's a very powerful gift to give someone, to acknowledge some of the kind of stressors and anxieties that wealth can create.
We're starting to see more and more peer groups or peer networks in Australia? Is that something that's been happening in America for some time?
Well, I can only speak to my experience. I do think so. And I think, specifically women's groups have been very powerful for me. I have been in a group of women with capital, and we've looked together and learned together and cut through the jargon. Like, there's no stupid question here. Let's look at our portfolios. Let's talk about asset classes. What does that even mean? And creating that safe space for others like me to learn from each other and to learn together and to explore venture capital and angel investing and philanthropy and bonds and stocks and all different sort of vehicles and forms of moving money. And to talk about the emotional side of that as well, like what are our goals? What is our purpose? What are our values and how we think about money? So that peer group has been very powerful for me. It's been a real catalyst in getting me to think about my money differently, but it's also given me a lot of confidence. And it's a community that I highly value. So yeah, I think the peer learning is really important. And it's really why I wrote my book too. It's like, here, I'm going to share a story about what it's been like for me. And I've had so many people come to me and say, oh, I thought I was alone. It can be very isolating. I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one who felt this way, or whose parents reacted this way, or who's been struggling with a sibling or with a friend. So kind of that peer connection is very important.
And as you've gone through the book and built out your network and had these conversations, it sort of jumps at me. There's three sort of buckets of people that you probably met. There's those that have accumulated wealth over time. There's those that have come into a lot of money pretty quickly. And you've got those that come from generational money. Do the conversations merge over time, or have you found it very hard to have those conversations depending on where they come from?
I think they're very connected. I mean, I now done a lot of speaking and working with people who have generational wealth. So fifth generation wealth holder who's struggling. I mean, I was speaking in Cornell and it was to a group of family business owners, and one girl, a woman who's, I don't know, in her late 20s, who had wealth, came up to me afterwards and she said, wow, thank you so much. This really, really resonated. And it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that what I'm feeling is real, which is really helpful. Like, I will be talking to my friends. I have some friends who work at Apple, and I ask them, can you get me a discount on a computer? And they look at me like, why do you need a discount? Or I'll be like in my apartment with my friends looking for a cheap flight. And they're like, why are you looking for cheap flights? And it's so distancing and it's so othering, and it's looking at my money first and not me as a person. And so it kind of really helped her to kind of recognize that, yeah, it is an issue that happens. So if, even for her, who was someone who, had generational wealth, she was still facing a lot of the same things that I feel out in the world as well. I think there's a lot of commonality. That said, I also think that there's sort of stereotypical things that happen, which I've learned sadly through my own daughters. So I have two daughters, they're 25 and 23, and they have a typical inheritor reaction to the money that they have. They both feel very, very guilty, and they feel like we have this money and we didn't do anything to earn it. And my daughter, is in her job working, and she's like, all my coworkers are struggling and talking a lot about money, and I feel really guilty that I have this privilege. And that's, I think, typical of the inheritor. It makes me sad, and because I feel like I was very lucky. I didn't deserve it either. Who deserves so much when there's like so much inequity? I was at the right place at the right time, and she was born into a family that has this great fortune. And I think part of what I'm trying to do to help people kind of get comfortable with their money is it just doesn't help anyone. It certainly doesn't help you to feel guilty. It doesn't help anyone else if you're just feeling guilty. Finding real purpose and a mission or a meaning with whatever gifts you have, I think is important for all of us.
So you've mentioned philanthropy a number of times now, and it also sounds like that's been how you've come to terms maybe with your wealth that you've come into. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what the impact's been?
Philanthropy is a big part of what my husband and I are doing now. And I think in the past, it was sort of a box to check and expected and something I wanted to do. But now I look at philanthropy as a piece of the way I'm moving my money or using my money to create the change I want to see in the world. I want to be that change. I want to create a more equitable world. I'm very focused on helping close the racial wealth gap. And that means directing money philanthropically, but also through investments. And I really, just in the last couple of years, have recognized that investing is not just boring number crunching. As soon as I recognize that where my money is important and that money has power, I can invest in not only financial return, but social return. That's when investing got interesting to me. And I really didn't know anything about venture capital. I didn't know anything about anything really until I was part of this women's group, actually. It was a big catalyst for me. And now I've been seeking out and investing with women, for one, because women get 2% of venture capital. Women of color get less than a percentage. So I want to direct money to those women who then can invest in places that are doing things differently and changing the world, women's healthcare with technology. I've invested actually with 4 different women of color who have their first-time fund managers. And it's really exciting. I'm proud of that.
And you and your husband have started a movement or created a hashtag. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this was started during COVID. We were sheltering in place. We were freaked out as everyone else was, the uncertainty and what's going to happen and the need out there. And this was the moment to do more giving. And I'd kind of already doubled down on places that I already gave to, extended 3 years gifts. And, we were already doing that, but we felt like we need to do more. We wanted to just give to all nonprofits that were doing good work on the ground. But we wanted to amplify that. And we were very aware of, in the United States, there's a thing called a DAF, a Donor Advised Fund. It's a charitable vehicle. You put your money in, and it's open to many people. You put your money in, you get your tax break up front, and then you give your money out over time. At least that's the concept. What's happening is people put their money into a DAF, and then it's not moving through. There's no payout requirement, so there's no timeline that is forced on you, so you can let your money sit. And we were aware that there was $120 billion sitting in donor-advised funds. Meanwhile, there was nonprofits and people starving. So we decided that we would put up $1 million and we'd create this movement called Half My DAF and say, all right, we have this pot of money. If you commit anyone out there in the country to halving your DAF, spend out half of the money in your donor advised fund, you'll be eligible for matches from us. We came up with this, talking in our backyard. And I have to say, even now that I've written this book and I'm out talking about wealth, there was a moment of pause because it's very vulnerable to say I'm putting up $1 million. It's like, everyone's going to know that. Luckily, I moved through that, but it still exists. But I'm glad I did. And we started this Half My DAF in May of 2020. By September, the end of September, we had moved $8.6 million from DAFs out to nonprofits. And people were thrilled. I mean, DAF holders basically were telling us, this is the nudge I needed. This was inspiration. I'm sitting around the dinner table with my adult kids. We're talking about where we want to give, what our values are. Nonprofits, of course, were thrilled, with an opportunity to get this matching grant. And it was very exciting. It was actually really also very fun to do this project with my husband. That was another point. I was like, how's this going to go? We created a website. We talked to press. We got actually a lot of great press. We had to kind of gather the data. We enlisted the help of our younger daughter who was home because of COVID. So it kind of became a family effort. And it was really exciting to see the difference that we made. And we hadn't planned on doing it again, but we started to hear people say, when you do this next year. So for 2021, we again did Half My DAF. And this was another exciting thing that happened was my husband and I had again said, we'll put up $1 million. We had partners join us this year in the matching pool. And then for Christmas, our daughters gave us their own money as part of Half My DAF. And they said, our older daughter said, I want my money to go to racial justice issues. And our younger daughter said, I want my money to go to climate and environment. So we created more money for organizations that were addressing those issues. We've done it again in year 3, and it's very exciting, and I hope we're making a difference. The problem is that donor-advised funds are still a problem. Policy change needs to happen around them. We're kind of the grassroots organization that's kind of trying to move that money. There's now, at the time we started, it was $120 billion. It's going the wrong direction. There's now $238 billion sitting in donor-advised funds.
But that's the opportunity.
That's the opportunity. That's a huge opportunity. I mean, those are charitable dollars sitting, waiting to be deployed and put to work. It's kind of like the DAF has become this tax shelter.
The institutions must love it, though.
The nonprofits love it. The institutions that hold the DAF, yes. I mean, this is the problem. So, we initially thought, we'll partner with large DAF holders like Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard. They're making money off the money sitting in their donor advised funds. But when we calculated, it was like hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's no incentive for the DAF holder or a sponsor to move the money. So it's all the structure. It's, again, in many places, the system needs to be changed. The structure, there's a real structural change that needs to happen.
Wonderful. Jennifer, we're unfortunately about to run out of time. This is clearly a topic that you're very passionate about, and we've only just scratched the surface. For those that are interested in finding out more, what are some of the resources outside of your book? And feel free to give the book a plug as well.
Well, you can look at our website, Half My DAF, www.halfmydaf.com. My website is jenniferrisher.com, and my book is We Need to Talk, a memoir about wealth. And I just encourage people. We all have a money story, so it's not only people with more money than they had growing up. We all have a lot of emotion around money, kind of the way we learned about saving and spending and giving as kids, the way our mother approached money, the way our father approached money, the attitude we had towards the rich or the poor, or where we fit in the neighborhood, or whether or not we talked about it. These are things that stick with us. So I think it's important for all of us to be aware of our money stories, because they hold biases and fears. And even when you think about being with your partner, talking about money, maybe one of you grew up believing that saving was really a virtue, and the other grew up believing that spending was important. You have to understand your own money story and your partner's, and have conversations to ensure that the money doesn't come between you.
Congratulations on everything you've achieved, and I look forward to grabbing a copy of the book and reading it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Between Meetings. For more episodes and to subscribe to our series, visit the NetWealth website, iTunes, Spotify, or your favourite listening service. And if you want to contact me or engage or discuss any of the topics raised, please find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, or send me a private message. We hope you can tune into the next episode.